Hello and welcome to the DSP Leaders Summit on the Open Telco. I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content at TelecomTV, and coming up now is our Solutions and Strategies Roundtable, where we'll be discussing the deployment of open source technologies in telco cloud strategies. So how is open source software reshaping communications networks? Why should telcos look towards commercial distributions, and how will they benefit from being more involved with open source projects? Well, let's find out what our guests think, and I'm delighted to introduce Yves Bellego, Director Network Strategy at Orange, Paul Miller, Chief Technology Officer for Wind River, and Beth Cohen, SDN Product Strategies with Verizon. Hello everyone, very good to see you all again. Thanks so much for taking part in the programme. Now, based on input from our viewers, as we've been doing all week, we've drawn up 5 key questions for this discussion. So these are the areas that are of most importance to our community. So let's get started with the first one. And Beth, I'm going to ask you this one first, if I may. Is open source actually reshaping telco cloud strategies? And if so, where's the evidence?
Yes, it is definitely reshaping cloud strategies in very many ways. And I think the impetus was the need to update all our infrastructures to support 5G and some of the newer types of networking, and also our connectivity to the hyperscalers. And there's been a huge amount of work with the open source community. I'll use just 2 examples very quickly. Well, 3 actually. So of course, as many are well aware, OpenStack is the default infrastructure, cloud infrastructure that's used in the telco industry today. So that's a wild success story. The support, the telcos did in fact embrace open source. And then in addition, there's been a lot of work within ETSI to develop standards around SD-WAN. And I'll speak about my personal experience with the LFN projects. There's 2 that have had a lot of telco input. The ONAP project, which is the project to develop orchestration tools, which has really been driven by the telcos, and the other one that is kind of my favorite is Aniket, which was the former CNTT project, which is developing reference models and reference architectures in support of NFV infrastructure architectures. And those projects struck a chord with the telecoms. There's been a lot of heavy participation from the telecoms, as well as the vendors in the community. So I think it has really, over the last 5 years, I've seen a huge shift in how telecoms perceive the importance of open source within their infrastructures and in support of their services and business models.
Thank you, Beth. Yves, as we've just heard from Beth, she's mentioned a few open source projects there. So I guess there is evidence that open source is continuing to reshape telco cloud strategies.
Yes, hello everyone, hello Guy, and in fact I would just support all what Beth said. Maybe to add that open source is reshaping not only the telco cloud strategy, but the overall telco strategy. It's not only about cloud, but just to give one other area is we use a lot of tools, probes, and in our networks, not only on the cloud, but on all type of layers, transmission, transport, radio, fixed access, and so on. And in that field also, we use more and more of open source, not so big projects as the ones mentioned by Beth, but this is another area where we do use open source. So now definitely open source is part of the ways for us to get new solutions, new tools deployed in our networks on the cloud and in other areas. And maybe to add on the cloud aspect, in fact, as Beth, we are quite involved in ONAP, in Anuket, in this type of projects. And in fact, now open source has really come as one way to get some standards as some other ways to get standards that existed previously, typically going through the more traditional standardization bodies. But that is just that has become today just one normal way as the others. And another evidence is we are just here to talk about it because we believe in it. We put energy and efforts on that topic.
Thank you, Yves. And Paul, what's your perspective on how open source is reshaping telco cloud strategies?
Yes, thank you, guys. So I think we certainly agree with everything that's been said here. There's certainly a tremendous amount of activity in a lot of different forums, and we're in a little bit different position than my partners here from Orange and Verizon, and that we're a vendor that provides infrastructure software into their networks, and as such, we very much believe in open source. The emergence of 5G and virtualized RAN as a particular use case has been one where we've seen an increase of open source utilization. We were fortunate with our customer Verizon, in fact, to have placed the world's first fully virtualized 5G vRAN data session with partners like Intel and Samsung in their network. And what many people don't know is that was actually done on a completely open source based technology. So that is under the Open Infrastructure Foundation, which used to be the OpenStack Foundation, a project called Starling X. And the interesting reason for that, why these new network architectures are really driving new open source activities, is that the legacy approaches, if we pick OpenStack, for example, it was really designed to be deployed in a monolithic data center, right? It wasn't designed to be highly geo-distributed across a large wide area network. And as you move to edge-based compute and intelligent edge systems, you have to have open source technology that provides that infrastructure as a more cloud native architecture across that large geography. And this is in addition to obviously the things going on in ONAP that were mentioned, as well as and a really important one that we feel passionately about, which is ORAN, relative to opening up the all the virtualization of the RAN components that are used within 5G.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yes, indeed. We're hearing an awful lot about Open RAN at the moment. I think, Beth, did you want to come back on this point?
I did want to pick up on the edge, which I think is as Paul said, increasingly important, both in 5G as well as customer edge. So I know Verizon has been pioneering in this area of being able to bring these types of services out to the edge, and we couldn't have done it without open source. And particularly as we move into, we based it on OpenStack because we started the project before containers had really taken off. But I see the containers and the work in the CNCF as more and more important for developing, being able to develop applications at the edge, because obviously at the edge you need that efficiency and you need the ability to support distributed infrastructures, widely distributed infrastructures, and I know Starling X really is going in the right direction there, as is other open source projects.
Thanks, Beth. Well, we move on to our second viewer question, and this kind of is the flip side of the first one. Yves, I'm going to ask you this one first, if I may. Are new telco cloud approaches absolutely dependent on open source technologies now? And in which case, are there any key technologies we could mention?
On that, I would say that we need to improve all our networks, in fact, and take benefit of the latest technological evolutions. That has been the case with the 5G radio. That is the case with the virtualization via architectures. When it comes to open source, strictly open source, I do not see that much the technologies to be strictly related to open source. But we need to take benefit of all new technologies, containers, and so on. The point on open source is that the impact, especially within Orange, has been much more an impact on the processes, on the approaches, rather than a direct impact on the technologies per se. Because in fact, the technological evolutions would have happened whether we do it with open source or without. So in a sense, this is going to open source and going to the latest technologies are two routes, two tracks that we absolutely need to follow. They're combined together. Whether one is due to the other or not is not, in fact, the real question. But we just need to do it. And yes, we need to build, especially the 5G networks, on the latest technologies, not only on the radio but also on the core network, and also even on the transport layer. And that is using open source solutions and the latest virtualization and containerized solutions.
Thanks, Yves. Yeah, it gives us the right tools to do this job. Paul, what's your view here? Should we talk about how telco cloud approaches are dependent on open source technologies, or is it irrelevant? There is no real dependency here. It's just a route to achieve the goal.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think even when you originally asked it, the absolutely dependent, right, is a particularly interesting key term. I actually think the answer to this question is yes, and the reason why is if you look at the cloud approaches that are using all across telco, all based on Linux, right? There's a predominant foundation of Linux there, which is fundamentally from the open source community, and then whether you talk Kubernetes and cloud native container runtimes like Docker and Containerd, or you talk hypervisors with KVM and OpenStack technology, it's pervasive throughout the telco infrastructure. And yes, then I think it's absolutely dependent upon it. And it's growing more and more as we talked about the edge solution with Starling X, or container runtimes with networking interfaces like Calico. And there's just an absolute explosion of CNCF and other project communities that are bringing open source, and those are becoming the foundation of telco cloud strategies as we know them today.
Thank you, Paul. And Beth, what do you think here? Because Paul's right to sort of focus on a part of this question, this absolute dependency. Are you seeing an absolute dependency?
I would say yes, but I would like to pick up on what Yves was talking about, which is I think it's not just about the technologies. I think the biggest shift that I've seen is a change in how these systems are deployed. It's really around changes to operational and process-driven changes. So the embrace of net DevOps and that whole agile approach to developing new tools, developing new services has been transformational within the telco industry. And I think the open source community has really driven that, in that the telcos are seeing how these tools can be developed more agilely and can be incorporated into our systems in a whole different way. Automation has yes, of course the telcos have been automating things for years, but automating them in a way that is fundamentally different from what we did before, where we just took existing processes and just said, okay, we can automate these bits and pieces. We're really taking a much more agile approach to how that automation is done. I know we're not there yet, but I think we're moving to the point where we can do, drive agile transformations so that test-driven software development and other types of things that are well known within the open source community is coming back into the telco.
Thanks, Beth. And Paul, I think you were nodding in agreement there. But I'm going to move on to our next question. I'm going to come to you first, so maybe you can respond to that if you'd like to as well. But our third question from our audience is moving on to the idea of managed open source and the adoption of managed open source or commercially supported open source, and how is this helping to convince telcos to invest in open source solutions?
Well, I think that again, a really great question from your audience. It's very pertinent to what's actually happening in the telco industry. While there's a huge amount of benefit from using open source technology, it's really crowdsourced innovation and a rapid pace of development in the community, because you have kind of an open ecosystem and community where people can contribute and innovate, right? That's the best aspect of an open source activity. However, at the same time, no telco service provider is going to take open source right off the internet and run it in their network. It's unsustainable, right? And in fact, there are many different variations and options as you pull that down. What host OS does it run on? What plugins do I use? You have to package and harden that that open source project, as it were, as it's deployed in the telco network. And this is where the commercial vendors, such as ourselves, have found a good place where we can provide the best hardened high availability solution with service level agreements and support maintenance, patches, upgrades, the ability to perform service recovery and respond to network outage events. That requires a commercial vendor to step in front and support the telco service provider. But in doing so, passing through transparently the open source project and technology directly into that network kind of gives the service provider market the best of two worlds. You've got the open source innovation and rapid technology growth, and then you've also got a hardened commercial vendor behind you, guaranteeing your 5 or 6 nines high availability network.
Thank you, Paul. Well, let's then push this question to our two telcos on the panel. Yves, let me start with you. How is the adoption of managed open source helping convince yourself and other telcos to invest in open source solutions?
Yes, just in fact to complement on what Paul said, because for us at Orange, in fact, open source is not a target in itself. The point is when we are deploying our networks, whether we do it open source or not is kind of a technical decision that we make. But the goals that remain the same, that we need to provide connectivity, quality of service, resilience, and just to insist a bit on the resilience, because that one is pretty important in our industry. And that is something that requires a lot of efforts from the industry to provide the resilience of all the solutions that we deliver. And at the end, we use some open source. We do that. Some people like Verizon and Orange are heavily involved in open source communities. That does not mean that we reuse these open source solutions straight from the software to the network. So there is a lot of things to be done to integrate in our solutions, and we do not pretend to do all that by ourselves. And at the end, the goals remain always connectivity, quality, and resilience.
Thank you, Yves. And Beth, what about yourself? How do you see the adoption of hardened or commercially supported open source helping convince telcos to go this route?
So I do see that, and I'd like to pick up on what Yves and Paul said, which is that it's a partnership. And I think the open source community allows the vendors and the telcos to work together to create the solutions that are needed. And the telcos provide the requirements, and in some cases also require some of the, add some of the coding. And of course, the vendors also, provide both requirements and coding as well. So I see that, just to pick on my pet project, Aniket. Aniket is a merger of the CNTT project, which was primarily requirements driven out of the telcos, with the OPNFV project for testing and badging of the solutions. And so that allows both the telcos and the vendor community to work together. We actually structured the TSC, the technical committee, to be half telco and half vendor, and that was done on purpose so that both groups could really work together to create those requirements and solutions that are needed to drive back into the telco infrastructures.
Thanks, Beth. Yves, our next question is a little, it's connected to the previous question in a way, but here goes, and that's, should telcos focus their attention on commercial distributions of open source stacks?
Yes, on that one, I would not have a definite answer. As I said, there are different type of operators. Those who are heavily involved in the communities, those who are not involved. The good point from the good outcome from my point of view is that we have the choice. What is important is that we get the choice, because our fundamental drivers is, first, we need standardized solutions, and solutions that come through open source communities are standardized. And we also need to avoid any vendor lock-in or solution lock-in. So we need to keep flexibility because our networks are evolving every day, so they will need to evolve. So we need to keep the flexibility to make these networks evolve. And for some people, that will come by doing things, integrating themselves. For other people or other parts of the networks, that will come by using commercial off-the-shelf solutions. The point is we need to have both available, and then we select, and typically different operators may have different decisions because they are in different situations.
Thank you, Yves. Paul, if I can come to you now. Should telcos focus their attention on commercial distributions of these stacks? And, as Yves says, we want to avoid vendor lock-in. The operators have been calling for this avoidance for a long time now. They don't want to go back to those ways.
Well, to be somewhat transparent as a vendor providing a commercial distribution of open source, I'm going to say absolutely yes, they should, right? No, I think that, as Yves said, that it's really important to have the options, right? And, one great example of that is, as I spoke a moment ago, the service provider needs somebody to stand behind it in their network and help support them deploy it, do network engineering, do support and maintenance in the field, that sort of thing, and provide that support to augment their own staffing. So that means a commercial vendor is involved. How that commercial vendor is involved is a different animal, right? With there's different vendors having different commercial models as to how they bring open source into the telco service provider. It's also important as we talk about avoiding vendor lock-in that because you're focusing on maintaining open source as a directive, right? This gives the community, but also the service provider, the ability to make contributions into that open source upstream. And then that naturally flows downstream back into their network through the vendors that are providing the commercial distribution that then harden it and then support it in their network. So it's kind of a really neat thing where the service provider themselves can add functionality and change the direction of the open source community with the open source community, but still have a vehicle by which hardened solutions deployed in their network. So yes, I do think a commercial vendor standing behind a distribution is important, but always making sure it's a 100% upstream based open source model.
Thanks, Paul. That's a good point at the end there. And Beth, what do you think of the commercial distro approach for the wider telco community?
So I think it really, as Yves said, I think it really depends very heavily on the telco or operator. I'll widen that to some of the cable operators and any type of operator that's involved in transport and network in some sense. So part of what you need to support open source is you need the capability of creating code. And the telcos are traditionally not really good at that. So that's where, operators like, the vendors like Wind River come in place because, Wind River can focus in on, the open source solution that maps to, their a solution, in the case of Wind River, Starling X. But some telcos have chosen to go down the route of building the skill set and having that pool of developers who are doing the development work. And I'd say with Verizon is probably a mix because we have a lot of legacy systems, I'm sure Orange does too, that we just have to do in-house. And because these systems are particularly in the OSS/BSS side of things, and those systems tend to be sort of proprietary. So those, we kind of focus on those and then really depend upon our vendors to provide the hardened systems and the support for a lot of the open source solutions. So I'd say it's a mix.
Great, thanks, Beth. And we get to the final question from our audience for this panel. And Paul, I think I'll come to you first with this one. In what ways is open source technology being best utilized by the telcos? And are there any particular applications where open source is playing a particularly significant role, would you say?
Well, I'd say we're all, and I'm sure your audience is aware of for many years, the emergence of NFV and the ETSI standards activities, the orchestration layers, MANO, all of these things are in heavy use in the industry today. The thing that I think is happening in more recent years is a modernization of the use of this from a software context. So, for example, Beth had mentioned earlier agile methodology, right, and CI/CD. The concept of infrastructure as code, right, is a modern way to manage the deployment of infrastructure. The other thing I think that's happening in open source is gradually, from exposure to the telco domain, you really learn a couple things. One is you obviously have to have in the open source deliverable the technology components that enable the application, right? That's kind of table stakes, right? And whether that's Kubernetes or OpenStack or whatever, and all the different components that go there. The thing that's really unique, though, about the service provider market versus the IT or enterprise back office space is the operational characteristics, right? That you need to have some things that deal with scale. So zero touch deployment, zero touch provisioning. Do you have live software upgrade and patching capabilities in your system? Do you have a single pane of glass that you can manage the entire network? How much automation around AI and machine learning do you apply for outage avoidance, right? And so these are topics that open source is just starting to get their hands around, and they're really providing the next wave of innovation around the operational tool sets that then really help solve problems that are near and dear to the heart of the service provider.
Thank you, Paul. Yves, what's your views here? Because then at the beginning of our discussion, you were talking about using open source for tools and tooling. Are there any particular applications where you see open source as playing a particularly significant role?
Well, in fact, as Paul said, all the area around the cloud virtualization, that is something, and the orchestration, operations, OSS is something that has been heavily discussed in the past years. I mentioned something that we don't talk so much, but there is a lot of open source that is all on the tooling. And something we don't talk so much also is that is not so much of the network, but for example, the boxes at home that we develop and deploy in our networks on the fiber network. There is also a lot of open source. So if we talk on the open source globally, it's spreading everywhere. In fact, one point I would like to insist that Paul also mentioned is also the Open RAN. That is one of the very important project, or what is being developed in the ORAN Alliance. That is also another area where it will develop a lot. So almost everywhere, and I would put a focus on the Open RAN.
Thank you, Yves. Yeah, it's becoming ubiquitous. Beth, what about yourself? Any particular applications where you're seeing open source as playing a key role, a significant role in telcos?
I would say certainly the greenfield 5G deployments, where we're able to bring in open source from day one. And as Yves mentioned, ORAN and all of those deployments, I think it's going to be important as we roll out network slicing and other new types of ways of running the networks. And as AI ML emerges, I know it's just in the beginning of it, open source is going to be key to make, for the success of these new tools. And Paul mentioned automation. Again, automation needs the open source because we can't keep reinventing the wheel every time. Testing tools. I was just involved in a white paper on automation, NFV, and testing that was just published a couple days ago. And again, we need open source across the industry to support these types of tools. Right now, most of the automation and testing is proprietary, or it's done by the telco itself, or it's done by a vendor. We're all solving the same problem, and for all of the telcos, it's not our business. Our business is providing services to our customers. And testing is important, obviously, to make sure that those services meet our high SLAs. But why should we reinvent the wheel? Why should each one of the telcos invest resources in creating test suites when it's the same problem across the industry?
Great point to end with. Thank you very much, Beth. We have to draw our discussion to a close now. Thank you all very much indeed for participating and sharing all your views and opinions.